Last chance before that gavel drops. $50 for the woman and her whole brood, or they go to separate buyers. The auctioneer's voice cut through the October wind that carried the scent of dust and desperate sweat across the courthouse steps. Ezra Callahan shifted his weight, spurs clinking against the warped boards, and felt the worn leather of his gun belt creak as he reached into his vest pocket. 12 children huddled behind their mother like quail chicks, their faces hollow with hunger that had carved shadows beneath their eyes. The forged deed in Judge Morrison's coat pocket crinkled as he leaned forward. Ink still wet from where he'd changed the dates with his fountain pen. Black ink over the original brown, turning 1883 into 1885 to steal the widow's claim. But Ezra couldn't know that yet. All he saw was Martha Henley's trembling hands and the way her youngest boy swayed on his feet. $50, Ezra called, his voice carrying across the crowd of vultures who'd come to pick clean the bones of another failed homestead. The gavel hesitated. Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed, calculating. He'd expected Silas Garrett to bid higher, to take the woman for his brothel and scatter the children to work camps across 3 territories. Morrison needed Garrett's cooperation to make his land-grabbing scheme work. Too many witnesses here meant too many complications. Going once. The judge's voice dripped honey over poison. Martha Henley lifted her chin, and Ezra saw steel beneath the desperation. Her husband had been dead 6 months, claimed by fever that had swept through their soddy like wildfire through dry grass. The children bore the marks of that same sickness. Hollow cheeks, brittle hair, skin stretched thin over bird bones. Twice. Garrett spat tobacco juice at Ezra's boots and stepped forward. $60 for the woman. You can keep the brats, cowboy. The courthouse clock struck 3, its bronze voice echoing across the settlement. Circuit Judge Hamilton would arrive on tomorrow's eastbound train, carrying the authority to review territorial land claims and adoption papers. Morrison's window was closing fast. Ezra's hand moved to his Colt, then stopped. Violence wouldn't save these children. It would only give Morris an excuse to jail him and let Garrett take them all. Instead, he pulled out a leather pouch that contained every dollar he'd earned driving cattle from the Powder River to the railroad at Cheyenne. $100, he said. For all of them. The crowd murmured. That was enough to buy a decent horse and saddle or pay a man's wages for 3 months of ranch work. Silas Garrett's face flushed red above his greasy beard. You got papers on that much money, Callahan? Morrison demanded. Ezra dumped the coins onto the courthouse steps, where they rang like silver bells against the wood. Mexican pesos, American eagles, and worn silver dollars from a dozen different mints. Honest wages for honest work under a dozen different brands across Wyoming territory. Sold, Morrison said quickly, before Garrett could bid again. The judge needed this transaction finished before anyone started asking questions about the Henley homestead claim. Martha Henley's knees buckled as her children surged around her. The oldest boy, perhaps 14, looked at Ezra with eyes that had seen too much death and not enough mercy. Name's Tom, the boy said. This here's my ma, and these are my brothers and sisters. Ezra knelt in the dirt, bringing himself to eye level with the smallest girl. She couldn't have been more than 4, with fever-bright eyes and hair the color of winter wheat. My name's Ezra, he said softly. And if you'll have me, I'd like to take you all home. The territorial adoption law required a petition filed with brown ink on official paper, signed by 2 witnesses and approved by a circuit judge. Ezra had studied the statute books during long winter nights, learning the legal requirements for claiming abandoned livestock. Children, it turned out, required similar documentation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the only physician within 50 miles, stepped forward from the crowd. Her medical bag contained bottles of laudanum and castor oil. But her real tools were the steady hands that had delivered half the babies in the territory, and the keen eyes that could spot corruption from across a courtroom. "Those children need immediate medical attention," she announced. "I'll provide it free of charge and witness any documents this man needs to file." Morrison's jaw tightened. Dr. Chen had been asking uncomfortable questions about suspicious land transfers, and her testimony carried weight with the territorial courts. Having her involved complicated his plans considerably. "This ain't over, Callahan," Garrett snarled, but he melted back into the crowd like a snake returning to its hole. Ezra gathered the children and their mother, leading them toward his wagon. The October sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and the wind carried the promise of an early winter. Martha Henley's wedding ring caught the light, thin gold worn, smooth by years of hard work. "Why?" she whispered as he helped her into the wagon bed. "Why would you spend everything for strangers?" Ezra checked the harness on his bay mare, buying time to find words that wouldn't sound like preaching. "Lost my own family to cholera when I was 16, he said finally. "Spent 10 years learning that having folks to care for is worth more than all the silver in Colorado." The ride to his ranch took 2 hours through sagebrush country that stretched endless as an ocean under the vast Montana sky. The children rode in silence, too exhausted for chatter, while Martha held the youngest ones close. Ezra's homestead sat in a valley where cottonwoods lined a creek that ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains. His cabin was built from logs he'd cut and dragged himself, chinked with mud and moss against the winter wind. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a lean-to barn sheltered his horses and milk cow. 40 acres of hay meadow stretched toward the hills, already cut and stored against the coming cold. "It ain't much," Ezra said as he helped them down from the wagon. "But it's got a good roof and walls that'll keep the wind out." Dr. Chen arrived an hour later, her black buggy raising dust clouds that settled like flour on the brown grass. She examined each child with gentle efficiency, prescribing rest, warm food, and patience for bodies that had been pushed beyond their limits. "The youngest 3 need constant care," she told Ezra privately. "Their lungs are damaged from living in that cold soddy all winter. Without proper medicine and nutrition, they might not see Christmas." Ezra nodded grimly. The adoption papers would have to wait. Keeping these children alive came first. He spent the evening moving furniture, creating sleeping spaces in his small cabin that would shelter 13 people through the coming Montana winter. Martha proved handy with a needle and thread, mending torn clothes while the children slept on blankets spread across the plank floor. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, creating order from chaos in the way that frontier women learned or died trying. "The homestead papers," she said quietly, not looking up from her sewing. Morrison claimed there was something wrong with the dates. Ezra's blood chilled. Land fraud was common enough, corrupt officials backdating claims to steal property from widows and settlers who couldn't fight back in court. If Martha's claim was legitimate, then Morrison had stolen it through forgery. "You got the original deed?" Martha reached into her worn carpet bag and pulled out a folded paper, brown with age and signed in fading brown ink. The date clearly read March 15th, 1883. 2 years before the version Morrison had waved around in court. "John filed this claim the day after we arrived," she said. "Paid the fee in silver dollars and got the receipt from the territorial office in Helena." Ezra studied the document by lamplight, noting the careful penmanship and official territorial seal pressed deep into the paper. The brown ink had aged naturally, developing the subtle color changes that came from 2 years of Montana weather and handling. "This is legal and binding," he said. Morrison's been stealing homesteads by changing dates on the deeds. The realization hit him like a mule kick. If Martha's claim was valid, then he'd just bought a family that legally owned 160 acres of prime ranch land. Land that Morrison and his cronies wanted for themselves. Thunder rumbled across the valley as the first October storm rolled down from the mountains. Rain drummed against the cabin roof while wind howled through the cottonwoods, bending them like dancers in the darkness. By morning, word had spread through the territory that Ezra Callahan was harboring the Henley family. Silas Garrett arrived with 3 armed men, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold dawn air. "Come out, Callahan," Garrett shouted. "You got something that belongs to me." Ezra stepped onto his porch, rifle cradled in his arms. Behind him, Martha gathered the children away from the windows, while Dr. Chen checked her medical bag for the derringer she carried for protection during house calls. "Don't recall you owning anything on my land," Ezra called back. "That woman was sold at legal auction. I got prior claim." "Auction's over, transactions complete. You got no business here." Garrett's face twisted with rage. He'd planned to use Martha as bait for his brothel and sell the children to mining camps that needed small hands for dangerous work. Losing them meant losing profit and face among the territory's criminal element. "We'll be back," Garrett snarled, wheeling his horse around. "With legal papers and enough men to enforce them." As the riders disappeared into the sagebrush, Ezra felt the weight of what he'd started. Protecting this family would require more than good intentions. It would take legal proof, community support, and the kind of courage that looked death in the eye without blinking. Dr. Chen emerged from the cabin, her face grim. "The baby's fever is rising. Without proper medicine, she won't last the week." The nearest pharmacy was in Billings, a 3-day ride through country controlled by Morrison's allies. But Ezra's bay mare was fast, and he knew trails that avoided the main roads where Garrett's men might be waiting. "I'll leave within the hour," he said. "You stay here with Martha and the children." "That's exactly what they want," Dr. Chen warned. "Get you away from here so they can take the family without witnesses." Tom Henley, the oldest boy, stepped forward. His father's death had aged him beyond his 14 years, carving lines of responsibility around his eyes that belonged on a grown man's face. "I can ride," he said simply, "and I know country between here and Billings better than most grown men." Ezra studied the boy's face, seeing determination that reminded him of his own younger self. Sometimes survival meant trusting people who hadn't yet learned they couldn't handle the weight you put on them. "You know the risks?" "Yes, sir." "But Mary's my sister, and she needs that medicine." They rode out together as the sun climbed above the eastern peaks, following deer trails and hidden valleys that avoided the main roads. Tom proved his worth immediately, guiding them through country that would have taken Ezra twice as long to navigate alone. The October storm had left the high passes treacherous with mud and rockfall, but Tom's knowledge of the terrain kept them moving when other routes would have been impassable. They made Billings in 36 hours, bought the medicine Dr. Chen had specified, and started back immediately. But Garrett had anticipated their move. 6 armed men waited in the canyon that formed the only practical route back to Ezra's valley. The ambush was positioned perfectly. Steep walls on both sides, nowhere to run, and enough firepower to cut down anyone who tried to fight through. "End of the trail, Callahan," Garrett called from behind a boulder. "Drop your guns and come quiet. We might let the boy live." Ezra's mind raced, calculating odds and options. The medicine in his saddlebags represented little Mary's only chance at survival. But getting killed here would doom all the children to lives of slavery or worse. Tom solved the problem with the kind of desperate courage that defined the frontier. While Ezra drew Garrett's attention, the boy spurred his horse up the nearly vertical canyon wall, following a game trail that only someone with intimate knowledge of the country would attempt. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as Tom disappeared into the rocks above. Ezra dove for cover, knowing the boy would either make it home with the medicine or die trying. There was no middle ground in country this harsh. "You just killed that kid," Garrett snarled. "Boy knows these mountains better than you know your own sins," Ezra replied, working his way closer to Garrett's position. "He'll make it home, and when he does, Dr. Chen will have everything she needs to treat those children legally." The battle lasted until sunset, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage in the rocky maze of the canyon. When full darkness fell, Ezra slipped away like smoke, leaving Garrett's men to curse the shadows and nurse their wounded. He reached his homestead 2 days later, riding a borrowed horse and carrying news that would change everything. Tom had made it home with the medicine, and Dr. Chen had successfully treated not just Mary, but 3 other children whose conditions had worsened during the fight. More importantly, Circuit Judge Hamilton had arrived on schedule and reviewed Martha's original homestead claim. The brown ink told its story clearly. This was a legitimate filing that predated Morrison's forged version by over a year. "Judge Hamilton wants to see you in town, Doctor," Chen reported. "He's called a formal hearing to investigate Morrison's land deals." The hearing took place in the same courthouse where Ezra had bought Martha's family, but this time federal authority controlled the proceedings. Judge Hamilton presided with the kind of stern competence that had earned him respect throughout the territorial courts. Morrison sat at the defendant's table, his confidence cracking as evidence mounted against him. The forged deeds were obvious when compared to legitimate documents. Black ink over brown, altered dates that disrupted the natural flow of the handwriting, and territorial seals that didn't match the official records. "The evidence clearly shows systematic fraud," Judge Hamilton declared. "Mr. Morrison, you're hereby stripped of your judicial appointment and remanded for trial on charges of conspiracy to defraud the territorial government." Martha Henley's homestead claim was restored, giving her family legal title to 160 acres of prime Montana ranch land. But more importantly for Ezra, the judge approved his adoption petition for all 12 children, making him their legal guardian and giving him authority to make decisions about their care and education. The courthouse erupted in celebration as word spread through the territorial community. Honest settlers had suffered under Morrison's corrupt regime, and his downfall meant justice might actually be possible on the frontier. But victory came with a price that cut deep into Ezra's soul. During the final confrontation with Garrett's men, his bay mare had taken a bullet that left her permanently lame. The horse that had carried him safely through a dozen dangerous situations would never run free across the Montana prairie again. Ezra led her to the barn that evening, running gentle hands over the scarred leg that ended her riding days. She nuzzled his shoulder with the trust of a creature that understood sacrifice, then settled into the stall where she would spend her remaining years as a beloved companion rather than a working partner. It was worth it, he whispered into her velvet ear. Every step was worth it. The adoption papers were signed in brown ink on official territorial stationery, witnessed by Dr. Chen and Judge Hamilton himself. Ezra's signature committed him to providing food, shelter, education, and protection for 12 children who would carry his name into the future. Martha chose to stay on her restored homestead. But the boundaries between the two properties disappeared as the families worked together to build something larger than either could manage alone. Barbed wire fencing, introduced to Montana territory in 1881, helped them establish clear property lines while creating shared grazing areas that benefited both spreads. Christmas morning found them gathered in Ezra's cabin, now expanded with a second room to accommodate the growing family. Mary Henley, fully recovered from her fever, sat on Ezra's lap while he read from a worn Bible that had belonged to his parents. Tom Henley had grown 3 inches and filled out with good food and steady work. He wore his father's wedding ring on a chain around his neck, a tangible link to the past that grounded him in the present. "What made you do it?" Martha asked that evening as they watched the children play in the snow outside. "Really?" Ezra considered the question while firelight danced across the cabin walls. His lame bay mare nickered softly from the barn, content in her retirement. The adoption papers hung framed above the mantelpiece. Brown ink faded, but still legally binding. "Maybe it was seeing myself in Tom's eyes," he said finally. "Or maybe it was knowing that some choices echo longer than the mountains stand. But mostly, I think it was learning that family isn't about blood. It's about who you'd risk everything to protect." Outside, the Montana wind sang through the cottonwoods, carrying the promise of spring across valleys where children who had once faced slavery or death now ran free under endless sky. The sound echoed off cabin walls that sheltered 13 souls who had found each other in the darkest hour and chosen to become something new. Years later, when Tom Henley filed his own homestead claim and built a cabin for his wife and children, he would carve Ezra's initials into the gatepost as a reminder of the day $50 and one man's courage changed the course of 13 lives. The brown ink on those adoption papers had faded, but the bonds they created grew stronger with each passing season. In a territory where corruption often triumphed over justice and might made right more often than law, they had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, mercy could prevail over malice, and love could build something worth defending from the ashes of despair. Don't forget to subscribe and consider giving a like to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.